from brave souls to midnight whispers, traverse this realm at your own peril. For within these tales lurk horrors most foul. Tonight's tale may twist the very fabric of your sanity. And a word to the wise, this narrative paints pictures of terror not meant for every eye or ear. Venture ahead if you dare, but remember, you have been warned.
The drive into the small town was long and uneventful, the kind that lets your mind wander into places best left unvisited. I arrived as the sun was making its final bow, casting long shadows across streets that seemed to have seen better days. The town, which I'll leave unnamed, was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. But beneath its sleepy facade, something sinister was brewing. I parked my truck a block away from the main street, preferring to keep a low profile. My old, rugged Ford, filled with an arsenal of weapons and tools, was conspicuous enough without parking it in front of the diner. As I walked, I took in the town, noting the details. The way the local hardware store was still open, the flickering neon sign of the motel, the group of teenagers loitering outside the convenience store, trying to look nonchalant but failing. The diner was straight out of a postcard from the 50s, with its checkered floor and red vinyl seats. I chose a spot at the counter where I could see the door and keep an eye on the patrons. The place wasn't crowded, a few locals grabbing a late dinner, their conversation a low murmur. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard snippets of conversations, the usual small-town chatter, but underneath it all was a current of unease. People spoke in hushed tones about the attacks, throwing glances over their shoulders as if afraid of being overheard. The waitress, who introduced herself as Maggie, seemed to know everyone by name. When she came over to top off my coffee, I decided to probe a little. "Seems like this town's had its fair share of excitement recently," I remarked casually. Maggie hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "If by excitement you mean those animal attacks, then yeah, we're all abuzz. It's nothing. Probably just some coyotes getting bold," she said, but her eyes told a different story, one of fear and uncertainty. I thanked her and paid for my coffee, leaving a generous tip. As I left, I noticed the man covered in dirt and sweat, his eyes wild with an untold story. Approaching him as a wildlife researcher was a calculated move. It gave me a harmless cover and, more importantly, a reason to ask questions. His name was Tom, a local farmer. His tale was unsettling. Livestock found mutilated, not eaten, as if whatever did it was killing for sport. He spoke of strange noises at night, an unnatural howl that made your blood run cold, and shadows moving in the woods, larger than any animal he'd ever seen. After thanking Tom, I stepped outside into the cool night air. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the town. I headed towards my truck to gear up. This wasn't going to be a straightforward hunt. The creature I was tracking was smart, careful. It didn't just hunt, it terrorized. And something about Tom's story didn't sit right with me. There was a piece of this puzzle missing, a piece I needed to find. As I loaded my weapons, a crossbow, silver-tipped arrows, and a few more esoteric items for good measure, I pondered the situation. This creature was different, its pattern unfamiliar. I'd need to approach this like a detective, gathering clues, piecing together the story, until I found its lair, or more importantly, its human guise. Because in my line of work, sometimes the monster you're hunting isn't just a beast lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it's someone you pass on the street, a person with motives and a plan. And to stop them, you need to think like them. I locked up my truck and headed back into the heart of the town, my senses on high alert. The real work was about to begin and I was ready. I am Artimus and this is my hunt. Night had fully taken hold of the town, the streets now deserted except for the occasional flicker of movement behind curtains. Shadows clung to the buildings, creating pockets of darkness that seemed to watch me as I moved through the town. It was in one of these shadows that I first encountered the creature. I was making my way down an alley, a shortcut to the area where the most recent attacks had occurred. That's when I heard it, a low growl, almost imperceptible, but there. I froze, every instinct honed by years of hunting screaming at me to be still. Slowly I turned towards the sound. It was there at the far end of the alley, its eyes reflecting the moonlight like two silver coins. It was massive, larger than any wolf, its form hulking and distorted, as if it were not fully committed to its shape. We stared at each other, hunter and hunted, each assessing the other. In a fluid motion, I drew my crossbow, already loaded with a silver-tipped bolt. Silver, the bane of werewolves. But as I looked at this creature, a nagging doubt crept into my mind. This was no werewolf. It lunged, faster than anything its size had any right to be. I fired, the bolt striking it in the shoulder. It howled, a sound that was both human and beast, and for a moment I thought I had it. But then it did something I didn't expect. It pulled out the bolt and kept coming. Silver didn't stop it. I didn't stick around to ponder this development. I turned and ran, knowing that a direct confrontation without knowing its weakness was suicide. Behind me, I could hear its ragged breathing and heavy footsteps. I ducked into another alley, then another, using my knowledge of urban environments to my advantage. Finally, I lost it, or it decided I wasn't worth the trouble. I didn't slow down until I was several blocks away, my lungs burning and my mind racing. This was something else, something older. The legend spoke of ancient creatures, ones that predated the common monsters like werewolves and vampires. Beings that were not so easily killed by silver or holy water. I'd always thought those were just stories, tales to scare young hunters, but now I wasn't so sure. I leaned against a wall, catching my breath. This hunt had just become a lot more complicated. I needed to research, to dig into the old legends and find out what I was dealing with. And I needed to do it fast before this creature claimed another victim. As I made my way back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That creature was more than just a monster. It was a mystery wrapped in shadow and blood. The night had grown deeper, and the streets were now silent, the town asleep, unaware of the nightmare lurking in its midst. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, theories about the creature I had just encountered. It was clear I needed insight beyond my own, something that could only come from experience much older than mine. There was someone I knew, a connection from my father's days. His name was Edgar, a seasoned hunter who had retired to a life of seclusion, his days of facing the horrors in the dark long behind him. He lived on the outskirts of this region, in a cabin surrounded by woods that held secrets of their own. I made my way out of the town, the roads empty, the only sound the gravel crunching beneath my truck's tires. Edgar's place was off the beaten path, a forgotten corner of the world where the old ways still held sway. As I drove, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. Edgar was a mentor of sorts, but he was also a reminder of a past I sometimes wished to forget. He had fought alongside my father, had been there in the early days of my training, his teachings harsh but necessary. But with those teachings came memories of losses, of friends and loved ones consumed by the darkness we hunted. His cabin came into view, a lone sentinel in the midst of the wilderness. I killed the engine and stepped out, the air crisp and cold, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I approached the door and knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. The door opened and there stood Edgar, older than I remembered, his eyes still sharp but now framed with lines of age and weariness. "Artimus," he greeted, his voice a gravelly echo of the past. "I can't say I was expecting you." "I need your help, Edgar," I said, getting straight to the point. "There's something out here, something I've never seen before." He studied me for a moment, then stepped aside to let me in. His cabin was a reflection of the man himself, walls lined with old books and relics from hunts long past. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. We sat, and I told him about the encounter, about how the creature shrugged off a silver bolt as if it were nothing. Edgar listened, his expression pensive, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. When I finished, he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're dealing with something ancient, Artimus. Older than the werewolves and vampires you're used to. This creature, it's from a time when the world was a darker place, when things we now call myths walked the earth." He rose and walked over to a shelf, pulling down an old, dust-covered tome. There are beings, creatures that existed before our modern monsters became the stuff of legend. They're rare, and most hunters go their whole lives without encountering one. But when they do emerge, it takes more than silver or fire to stop them. He handed me the book, its pages yellowed with age. "You'll find what you're looking for in here. But be warned, knowledge of such creatures is not easily gained, and the price of hunting them is often high." I took the book, feeling its weight, both physical and metaphorical. "Thank you, Edgar. I'll be careful." He nodded, a look of concern etched on his face. Be more than careful, Artimus. Be prepared for a fight unlike any you've had before. I left Edgar's cabin with the book tucked under my arm, the night now beginning to give way to the first hints of dawn. The road back to town was a blur, my mind consumed with what lay ahead. The creature was more than just a hunt. It was a challenge to everything I knew. But I was ready to meet that challenge. I had to be. Because if I wasn't, this town and perhaps much more would fall into darkness. Back in the town, under the light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I found myself standing at the threshold of a deeper, more insidious mystery. Edgar's words echoed in my mind, painting my hunt in hues more complex than the simple black and white of predator and prey. Armed with the ancient tome, I decided to visit the town's library. Perhaps it was a researcher's instinct or a hunch, but I felt there was more to be discovered within the history of this seemingly innocuous place. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, watched me with curiosity as I pored over old newspaper clippings and historical records. That's when I found it. A series of articles, yellowed with age, detailing the town's history. Among the mundane stories of town fairs and local politics, there were brief mentions of a group, a coven that was active decades ago. They were dismissed as a harmless cult, their practices strange but not threatening. Yet the timing of their activities lined up eerily with unexplained disappearances and unsolved tragedies in the town. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place. The creature I was hunting, the Elder God, wasn't just a remnant of a bygone age. It had been brought back into this world through the belief and rituals of these cultists. They were feeding it, strengthening it with their sacrifices. I needed to find them to understand how deep this rot ran in the town. It was no longer just about killing a monster. It was about rooting out a corruption that threatened to consume everything. My investigation led me to the outskirts of the town, to an abandoned warehouse that had once been a meeting place for the cult, according to the records I found. The building loomed large and foreboding, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of a long-dead corpse. Inside, the air was thick with the residue of rituals long past. The walls were adorned with faded symbols and cryptic writings, the language ancient and unknown to me, but eerily reminiscent of the inscriptions in Edgar's tome. In the center of the warehouse was an altar, and though it had long been abandoned, the sense of something dark and malevolent still lingered. I scoured the place for any clues, any indication of where the cult might have relocated their activities. Hidden beneath the altar, I found a series of journals, their pages filled with ramblings about awakening their god and bringing about a new age. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. This cult had embedded itself within the town, its members likely posing as ordinary citizens. They were preparing for something, a ritual that would fully awaken the Elder God and unleash its power. I left the warehouse with a new sense of urgency. The cult was planning something soon. The recent surge in the creature's activity was proof of that. I had to find them, stop them before they could complete their ritual. The town, once a place of quiet anonymity, now felt like a maze of secrets and shadows, each turn revealing a new layer of conspiracy. But I was determined to see it through, to end this nightmare once and for all. As I walked the streets, now bustling with the morning's activity, I knew the answers were hidden in plain sight among the people I passed by. The cult was here and I would find them. The hunt was no longer just for a monster. It was for the salvation of a town unwittingly on the brink of destruction. The investigation into the cult required a different set of skills than monster hunting. I needed to blend in, observe, and gather information without raising suspicion. The town was small, and an outsider like me could easily attract unwanted attention. I decided to start at the local bar, a place where people tend to talk more freely. As I sat at a corner table nursing a drink, I kept my ears open. Conversations buzzed around me, a mix of local gossip and daily grumbles. Nothing out of the ordinary, until a particular snippet caught my attention. A group of townsfolk was discussing a recent town meeting, and one name was mentioned with a mix of reverence and fear: Reverend Miller. I remembered seeing a church on my way into town, a quaint old building with a small congregation. It struck me as odd that a reverend would invoke such a reaction. I decided he was worth looking into. The following morning, I attended the church service, blending in with the congregation. Reverend Miller was charismatic, his sermon captivating in a way that sent chills down my spine. He spoke of renewal and the cleansing of old ways, his words laced with an undercurrent of something darker. After the service, I lingered, watching the Reverend interact with his flock. His followers seemed devoted, hanging on his every word. It was then I noticed a symbol on the inside of his wrist, the same symbol I had seen in the warehouse. My next step was to discreetly follow Reverend Miller. It led me to a secluded house on the outskirts of town, where a group of people gathered late at night. I watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows. The group was performing a ritual, their chants echoing in the night air. The Reverend stood at the center, leading them. I had found the cult, and at its heart was Reverend Miller. Over the next few days, I kept a close watch on their activities. The cult was planning something big, something that aligned with the cycle of the moon. It was clear they were preparing for the final ritual to awaken their god fully. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but I needed more information. I needed to know where the ritual would take place and how to stop it. My opportunity came when I overheard two cult members discussing the ritual's location, an old abandoned mine on the outskirts of town. It was secluded, the perfect place for something as dark as what they were planning. I knew what I had to do. I had to stop the ritual and destroy the creature, but I also had to be careful. The cult was deeply rooted in the town, and I couldn't risk an open confrontation. The night of the ritual, I made my way to the mine. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the landscape. I could hear the chants of the cultists as I approached, their voices a discordant melody that set my nerves on edge. I crept closer, staying in the shadows until I had a clear view of the ritual site. The cultists were gathered around a pit, Reverend Miller at the forefront, his arms raised as he invoked their god. It was now or never. I readied my weapons, including a few special items I had prepared specifically for this encounter. This was more than just a hunt. It was a battle to save a town from the clutches of an ancient evil. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the shadows and into the heart of darkness. The creature, a monstrosity birthed from the shadows of an ancient world, surged into the clearing with a ferocity that turned the night into a tableau of horror. Its form was a grotesque parody of nature, muscles rippling under scaly skin, each movement a dance of death. As it descended upon the cultists, the air was filled with the cacophony of their screams and the wet sound of flesh being torn asunder. The carnage was immediate and terrifying. Limbs were flung aside like rag dolls, blood painting the earth in a macabre mosaic. Some cultists fell to their knees in fanatical worship, offering themselves to the beast, while others tried to flee, only to be caught in its relentless grasp. Reverend Miller, standing apart from the slaughter, shouted praises to the elder god, his voice a chilling counterpoint to the screams of his followers. He was not the creature but its prophet, a man lost to madness and dark devotion. I leapt into action, drawing a short sword etched with runes of ancient power. My crossbow was already primed, and I fired a volley of bolts at the creature, aiming for its eyes and throat. The bolt struck true, but the beast seemed unfazed, its hide too thick, its vitality too unnatural. Closing the distance, I engaged the creature in close combat. Its claws were like knives, each swipe meant to disembowel or decapitate. I parried and dodged, using my agility to avoid its deadly strikes. The creature was fast, but I was faster, years of hunting honing my reflexes to a razor's edge. The beast roared in frustration, its maw dripping with the blood of its victims. It lunged at a fallen cultist, devouring the remains in a grotesque display of regeneration. I watched in horror as its wounds began to close, the flesh knitting together before my eyes. I knew then that this fight would not be won by blades alone. Reaching into my coat, I pulled out a set of grenades, holy water mixed with consecrated silver shrapnel. I threw them at the creature's feet, the explosion engulfing it in a burst of sanctified flame. The beast howled, its flesh burning and sizzling from the holy concoction. This was my chance. I lunged forward, thrusting my sword deep into its abdomen. The creature writhed and thrashed, its blood a foul ichor that spilled over my hands. The battle raged on, a dance of death between hunter and hunted. I deployed every weapon in my arsenal, from blessed blades to sacred artifacts. The creature, despite its wounds, fought with a ferocity born of ancient malice. As the fight drew to a climax, the creature, weakened and bleeding from a dozen wounds, made a desperate lunge. I sidestepped, but not fast enough. Its claw caught my side, sending me crashing to the ground. My sword fell from my grasp, landing near a young cultist who had been watching the battle, terror etched on her face. She was the only one left, the others either dead or fled. As the creature advanced on me, its eyes alight with murderous intent, she made a choice. With a cry of fear and determination, she picked up my sword and drove it into the creature's heart. The beast let out a final agonizing howl before collapsing, its body dissolving into shadows as if it had never been. I lay there breathing heavily, my own wounds painful but not life-threatening. The young woman stood over me, the sword still in her hand, her eyes wide with shock. As the first light of dawn began to wash over the town, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I knew my time here was drawing to a close. The aftermath of the night's events was something I couldn't afford to stick around for. Authorities would have questions I couldn't answer, not without revealing a world they were better off not knowing. I gathered my gear, wincing at the pain from the wounds the creature had inflicted. They were deep but would heal in time. The physical scars always did. It's the ones you can't see that linger. The young woman who had ended the creature's life was still there, sitting on the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was in shock, her eyes staring blankly at the now empty space where the monster had fallen. "Hey," I said softly, approaching her. "You did good, but you need to leave now. Get somewhere safe." She looked up at me, her eyes focusing for the first time since the creature had died. What was that thing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Long story," I replied, "and one you're better off not knowing. Just remember that you stopped it. That's all that matters." She nodded, still dazed, and slowly got to her feet. I watched her walk away, knowing that her life, like mine, would never be the same again. I made my way back to my truck, parked in the shadows a few streets over. The streets were still deserted, the town yet to wake up from its slumber. I threw my gear into the back and climbed into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the town in my rearview mirror. This place would recover, its people would move on. They'd explain away the night's events in a way that made sense to them, something logical, something mundane. They would and couldn't know the truth, and that's how it had to be. The drive out of town was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the tires on the road. I had left many towns like this one, slipped away before dawn to avoid the consequences of my actions. It was a necessary part of the life I had chosen, a life on the road, a life hunting monsters. As the town disappeared behind me, I felt a familiar mix of relief and emptiness. Another hunt was over, another monster gone. But there would be more, there always were. And I would be there, ready to face them. Because I am Artimus, a monster hunter.
And so, another tale from the depths of night concludes. But remember, dear listeners, in the realm of midnight whispers, the echoes of our stories never truly fade. If tonight's tale left you hungering for more, explore our anthology of horrors. For those brave enough, delve into our previous stories and discover what lurks in the shadows. Before you venture back into the safety of daylight, remember to like this video if it sent shivers down your spine. Subscribe and ring the bell, so the whispers of the midnight hour always find their way to you. And should you dare, leave your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. We revel in knowing which parts of our tales resonate with your darkest curiosities. Until next time, keep listening to the whispers, for they have many tales to tell.